Section 1. It was one of those late summer afternoons when the air feels heavy with heat, the kind of day where even the crickets seemed too tired to sing, and I had been walking the perimeter of my property with a sense of quiet satisfaction, checking the fences, watering the last patches of my garden, and watching the cattle graze lazily near the creek that cut through the back half of my land, the golden fields stretching far and wide like a living sea of straw under the sun. Everything felt steady, predictable, the kind of peace you only appreciate when you've worked years to carve it out for yourself. And I remember pausing by the fence post, leaning against the rough wood, when I caught the faintest whiff of something acrid in the air, a scent so sharp and out of place that it made me stop mid-step, the smell of smoke. At first, I thought it was someone barbecuing in the neighborhood nearby, or maybe a truck backfiring on the highway. But then the breeze shifted, and the faint trail of smoke thickened into a choking presence, curling around my nostrils until my chest tightened with alarm. I turned slowly toward the western edge of my property, and there, to my absolute horror, a thin column of gray-black smoke was rising, faint but growing, a sinister flag that signaled disaster brewing right in the middle of my fields. I didn't even have time to think. My instinct screamed louder than reason, and I sprinted down the hill, boots pounding the dry earth as I cut across the pasture toward the source, the cattle scattering nervously at the smell, their low calls echoing in panic. And by the time I reached the first stretch of scorched grass, the crackle of flames was unmistakable, small orange tongues licking greedily at the tinder-dry stalks, spreading like spilled ink across a page, and I knew in an instant that if I didn't act, my land would become a furnace in minutes. My hands shook as I yanked out my phone, dialing 911, stumbling through my address and gasping fire, field fire, spreading fast, send everything you've got, before hanging up and shoving the device into my pocket, grabbing the garden hose by the nearby shed. Though even as the water sputtered from the nozzle, pitiful against the growing inferno, I understood it was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The heat slapped against my face as I advanced, swinging the hose desperately back and forth, soaking what patches I could, the steam rising in angry bursts as water hit flames. But for every spark I killed, three more leapt higher, carried by the wind as if the fire had a mind of its own. My neighbor Carl must have seen the smoke too, because within minutes I heard the rumble of his ATV coming across the dirt path, his frame silhouetted against the smoke as he yelled, "You need help," before jumping off and grabbing a shovel from my shed without waiting for an answer. And together we hacked at the earth, digging trenches, trying to carve a line that the fire wouldn't cross. More neighbors trickled in, people I only waved to at HOA meetings or on the road. Yet here they were, forming a desperate bucket line with coolers, water jugs, anything that could hold liquid, tossing it onto the fire while sweat poured down their faces, their clothes singed by sparks. But despite all of us fighting like demons, the blaze only grew stronger, hungrily advancing toward the heart of my fields, spurred by the relentless wind, and I felt a wave of helplessness crash over me, the realization that my years of planting, harvesting, and caring for this land could be reduced to blackened ash in a matter of hours. In those frantic moments, when the smoke stung my eyes and my throat burned with every breath, a darker thought crept in, unbidden but insistent. This wasn't an accident. I had spent weeks sparring with Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, who had wagged her finger at me more times than I could count about my unsightly fields, how the tall grass was a fire hazard, how the HOA expected better upkeep, and I remembered her words, sharp and mocking, "Maybe nature will take care of it for you if you won't." I pushed the thought aside because I didn't have the luxury of speculation when fire was consuming my land, but somewhere deep in my chest, that suspicion festered like a coal waiting to ignite. The wail of sirens in the distance finally cut through the roar of the fire, growing louder with every passing second, and I nearly collapsed with relief, waving my arms frantically to signal them, praying they wouldn't miss the narrow turn into the gravel path that led straight to my ranch. By the time the first fire engine pulled up, red lights flashing like salvation, my arms were trembling from exhaustion, my throat raw, my neighbors gasping for breath as they staggered back to make room for the professionals, and I watched with awe and gratitude as the firefighters leapt into action, hoses unfurling like coiled snakes, streams of pressurized water pounding the flames with a force I could never match, their movements practiced, efficient, fearless. I stepped back, wiping sweat and soot from my brow, heart hammering as I finally let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, my land could be saved. But the seed of suspicion, planted by Karen's threats and watered by the sight of those unnatural flames, was already taking root, waiting for the right moment to grow into certainty. Section 2: The fire crews fought like warriors against the blaze, their hoses unleashing torrents that hissed against the flames, steam rising in angry clouds, while neighbors who had rushed in to help stood back now, coughing and wiping soot from their faces, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and awe at how quickly nature could turn against us. And as I staggered to the edge of the pasture to catch my breath, hands trembling from the effort of trying to hold back a wildfire with a garden hose, I heard murmurs ripple through the group gathered near the fence line, voices low at first, then growing more insistent, and when I walked closer, wiping smoke from my eyes, I caught fragments of their words, saw her earlier, matches right by the ditch, and then Carl, my neighbor who had been shoveling alongside me, leaned close with his jaw set tight, his voice a low growl as he said, I hate to say it, but I saw Karen out here just this morning, walking along the property line like she was casing the place, and she had something in her hand, looked like a lighter or matches, and I remember thinking, what the hell is she doing way out here? The words hit me like another gust of smoke, choking and heavy, because as much as I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, it fit too well with her endless complaints at HOA meetings, the way she'd sneered at my fields, calling them an eyesore, and a fire waiting to happen, threatening me with citations if I didn't mow every square foot down to manicured lawn like some sterile subdivision. She had a vendetta, no doubt about it, and she had always been the kind of person who escalated when people didn't bow to her demands. As I stood there, staring at the flames chewing through my land, I replayed our last argument in my head, her leaning over my fence, sunglasses perched on her nose like a crown, telling me, "You'll regret ignoring the rules. You'll see what happens when the board has had enough of your mess." At the time, I brushed it off as more of her usual bluster, but now, with Carl's words still hanging in the air and the acrid stench of burning fields all around, it didn't feel like empty threats anymore. More neighbors chimed in, one saying they'd spotted her SUV parked half a mile down the road earlier than usual, another swearing they saw her ducking into the tree line near my property with what looked like a red gas can, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time because Karen was always poking her nose where it didn't belong. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire themselves, the community piecing together a timeline of Karen's suspicious movements. And I realized that I wasn't the only one whose got twisted with the certainty that this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, an act of malice that put not just my land, but the entire neighborhood at risk. The thought made my blood boil hotter than the flames, and I clenched my fists as I imagined her smug expression, the way she'd probably sit back in her pristine kitchen sipping iced tea while the rest of us fought to save our homes, thinking she'd finally rid herself of what she called that ugly prairie. My suspicion hardened into conviction when I noticed something the firefighters did too. The fire hadn't started randomly in the middle of the field, as would happen with a stray spark or carelessly tossed cigarette, but right along the property line nearest to Karen's backyard, where the grass had been scorched in a straight line, almost like someone had deliberately laid a fuse, and though the professionals hadn't said anything yet, I could see it in the way they glanced at each other there, sharp eyes scanning the burn patterns with growing certainty. I wanted to storm straight over to her house, pound on her door, and demand answers, but the sheriff had arrived now, his cruiser parked crookedly by the gravel drive, and I knew the smart thing was to let the evidence speak for itself, because Karen's arrogance was always her undoing. Sooner or later, she'd slip up, and when she did, I'd make sure everyone saw it. As the fire raged on and the firefighters pushed it back inch by inch, the crowd of neighbors buzzed with tension, a mix of anger and grim satisfaction that the queen of the HOA might finally have gone too far. And though no one wanted to say outright, I could feel the shift in the air. For once, it wasn't just me who was fed up with Karen, it was everyone, and the possibility of justice was beginning to spark like kindling in their hearts. Section 3: The fire trucks lined up along the gravel road like a small army, their red bodies gleaming even through the smoke, hoses unfurling in practiced precision. firefighters moving in teams with the kind of calm urgency that only comes from years of training, and as they cut down the flames with heavy jets of water, the immediate panic in my chest began to subside, replaced by a colder, sharper focus as I scanned the edge of the crowd that had gathered to watch, because there, standing, with her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line of faux concern, was Karen, dressed in her pristine white blouse and oversized sunglasses, as though she were attending a summer brunch rather than standing at the scene of an inferno, and the sight of her lit a fire inside me hotter than the one devouring my fields. She had the gall to stroll up to the command center where the fire chief and Sheriff Daniels were conferring, her voice carrying over the roar of engines as she declared, "I warned him this would happen. His fields are a hazard. And now, look, the whole neighborhood could have gone up." Her tone was theatrical, dripping with self-righteousness, as if she were the hero of this story, the lone voice of reason ignored until disaster struck. But what she didn't realize was that half the neighbors who had rushed to help me were now glaring at her with undisguised suspicion, some whispering, some pointing, and a few bold enough to tell the firefighters outright. "We saw her near the property line this morning, messing around with something. She didn't belong there." The chief, a broad-shouldered man whose soot-streaked face betrayed no patience for theatrics, raised an eyebrow at Karen's accusations, asking her calmly when she had last been near my property, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before waving her manicured hand dismissively, saying, "Oh, I walk for exercise sometimes. It's none of your business, but I've been warning this community for months about his dangerous overgrowth, and now you see I was right." But her words only made the murmurs grow louder, because everyone remembered those meetings where she'd ranted about my fields, how she'd threatened fines, how she'd claimed the HOA could take drastic measures if I didn't comply, and now, standing there with smoke curling into the sky behind her and ash drifting like black snow onto her spotless shirt, she looked less like a concerned citizen and more like the arsonist caught red-handed. The firefighters began examining the burn pattern more closely once the worst of the flames were under control, kneeling at the edges of the blackened earth where the fire had started, pointing to the way it had clearly originated in several small spots along the property line rather than from one single ignition, a telltale sign of human intervention, and one of them called over the sheriff, gesturing toward a patch of ground where a faint, oily sheen still glistened, unmistakably the residue of an accelerant. Daniels crouched, sniffed the air, and his face darkened as he stood, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Karen, who was still loudly blaming me for negligence, and though he didn't say it outright yet, you could see the suspicion hardening in his gaze the way a predator locks onto its target. I stayed quiet, standing among my neighbors, letting the evidence and Karen's own arrogance do the work for me, but inside I was seething, every fiber of my being wanting to shout that I knew she had done this, that she had endangered not only my livelihood but the safety of every family within a mile radius, and yet there was something deeply satisfying about watching her dig her own grave with every word, because the more she talked, the more transparent her desperation became. If he had listened to the HOA, none of this would have happened. She snapped, pointing at me as though I were the criminal, but the firefighter beside Daniels shook his head and said firmly, "This wasn't negligence, ma'am, this was deliberate. Someone set multiple ignition points, and we're going to find out who." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of water still dousing smoldering patches, and Karen's face drained of color beneath her expensive sunglasses, her lips parting in a sputtering denial that sounded less like confidence and more like panic. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks, some openly whispering to the sheriff about her long history of threats, others nodding toward her house, where conveniently her backyard butted directly against the section of field that had burned first, and the tide was turning visibly against her. For years she had ruled this neighborhood with intimidation and fines, but now the crowd's mood was shifting from fear to fury, a collective realization that Karen hadn't just been a nuisance, she had become a danger. The firefighters, now joined by an arson investigator, began marking the spots with small orange flags documenting evidence, and I knew in that moment that Karen's days of hiding behind the HOA were numbered. Because the truth was no longer a matter of suspicion whispered on porches, it was being written into official reports, carved into the blackened soil of my land, undeniable and damning, and the fact that she stood there trying to act innocent only made her guilt shine brighter for all to see. Section 4. By the time the last tongues of flame were finally beaten into submission, leaving behind smoldering black scars across what had once been my golden fields, the real blaze wasn't in the grass anymore, but in the thick knot of neighbors, firefighters, and deputies gathered near the property line, all of them now focused squarely on Karen, who had gone from feigned confidence to barely concealed panic, her hands twitching at her sides as she tried to maintain the same smug mask she had worn for years. And yet every word she uttered now cracked around the edges, betraying the fear gnawing beneath. She kept insisting this was my fault, that I had been negligent, that everybody knows he refuses to maintain his land. But the more she spoke, the more people interrupted, correcting her, reminding her that they had seen her near my fields earlier with a lighter, reminding her of her countless threats at HOA meetings where she declared she would take matters into her own hands if I didn't comply. And for the first time, I saw Karen not as the untouchable tyrant of the neighborhood, but as what she truly was, a cornered liar with nowhere to run. Sheriff Daniels finally stepped forward, his voice low, but carrying the weight of command as he said, "Ma'am, we're investigating this as arson now, and there are multiple witnesses placing you near the origin point this morning. You need to think very carefully about what you say next." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, and then in true Karen fashion, she doubled down, snapping, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. I was only walking by, trying to get some exercise, because clearly nobody else around here cares about keeping this place presentable. Those weeds have been a hazard for years, and maybe now he'll finally do something about it." That one slip, that maybe now he'll finally do something about it, was like a crack splitting open the dam, and you could feel the shift ripple through the crowd as every firefighter, every deputy, every neighbor processed what she had just admitted. Because in her arrogance, in her desperation to justify herself, she had practically confessed to setting the fire on purpose, and Daniel's eyes narrowed as he asked, "So, you wanted the weeds gone for good, is that what you're saying?" Karen backpedaled instantly, waving her arms frantically, insisting, No, that's not what I meant. You're twisting my words." But the damage was done, her voice shrill, her composure gone, and the investigator kneeling nearby raised a small plastic evidence bag containing the charred remains of what looked unmistakably like a red disposable lighter they had pulled from the burned site, right along the fence that divided my land from Karen's backyard. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and for once, Karen had no clever retort, only stammering denials that sounded weaker with each repetition, while Daniels crossed his arms and said calmly, "Ma'am, we'll be following this up officially, but I suggest you come down to the station to give a statement." That suggestion landed like a hammer blow, and Karen's face twisted with fury, her voice rising into a shriek as she accused everyone of conspiring against her. Me, the neighbors, the firefighters, even the sheriff himself, ranting about how the HOA gave her authority, how she was only doing what was necessary to protect the community, how none of this would matter if people followed the rules. And the sheer absurdity of her words made the crowd erupt in laughter and outrage at once, some shouting back that she had gone too far, others shaking their heads in disbelief that she thought she could still spin this to her advantage. I stood there silently soot-streaked and exhausted. But inside, I felt a grim satisfaction watching the mighty Karen unravel, her empire of fear crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance, because for years she had bullied us with fines and threats, but here she was, screaming and powerless while the law calmly closed in around her. The firefighters, no longer even pretending to listen to her, packed up their hoses and equipment with the efficiency of men who had seen this kind of spectacle before, and the chief muttered to Daniels, loud enough for several of us to hear, "We've seen enough. We'll file the report, and it'll be on her head," while neighbors whispered with gleeful vindication, already imagining the HOA meetings where Karen would no longer sit smugly at the head of the table, but instead be the subject of every whispered judgment and sideways glare. Karen, realizing the tide had fully turned, tried one last time to rally, shouting, "You'll all regret this. You're destroying an innocent woman's reputation." But even Jason, her own son, who had slunk out of the house halfway through the chaos, stood off to the side with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, refusing to meet her eyes, his posture radiating embarrassment rather than support. And that sight, Karen standing alone, shrieking into a crowd that no longer feared her, was the moment I knew the balance of power had finally shifted, that the woman who had tormented us all for so long had just written her own downfall in smoke and ash. Section 5, the weeks that followed the fire felt like watching the slow collapse of an empire that had ruled by fear for far too long. Because once the ash cooled and the reports were filed, Karen's carefully maintained illusion of power crumbled piece by piece, starting with the insurance investigators who visited my property, clipboards in hand, their boots crunching through the charred remains of what used to be waist-high grass and healthy stalks of corn. They photographed everything, interviewed witnesses, and one even pulled me aside to say bluntly, "Mr. Daniels, this doesn't look like negligence. This looks like intentional ignition." And I nodded because by then everyone in the county already knew who the finger pointed to, and sure enough, when they visited Karen's house the next day, she tried to shoo them off her porch, yelling that she didn't have time for their witch hunt, but they calmly noted her refusal to cooperate and left, knowing full well they already had. The statements, the lighter, and her own slip of the tongue recorded by multiple smartphones in the crowd that night, because neighbors had wasted no time uploading clips of her screaming about wanting the weeds gone for good, clips that spread through our community Facebook page like wildfire of a different sort, each share carrying more outrage, more mockery, until Karen's name became synonymous with arson, recklessness, and disgrace. The sheriff's office moved slower, but when deputies eventually knocked on her door with a summons for questioning, the sight of her being escorted down her driveway, while neighbors peeked from windows and porches, was like a collective exorcism, a long-awaited moment when the boogeyman lost her mask, and though she tried to maintain her signature sneer, it cracked into desperation when they read the charges: reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and suspected arson, charges heavy enough that even the HOA board, which had protected her for years, finally convened an emergency meeting without her and voted unanimously to strip her of her position, a fact I only learned when one of the quieter members, Mrs. Callahan, showed up at my porch with homemade pie and a shy smile, saying, "We should have stood up to her sooner. We're sorry you had to pay the price for our silence." And while I accepted the apology graciously, inside I felt a glow of vindication that no pie could match. My fields, meanwhile, became a symbol of resilience because the very neighbors Karen had tormented, families she had fined for paint colors, gardeners she had harassed over lawn height, kids she had scolded for sidewalk chalk, those same people showed up with tools, seeds, and sweat, helping me clear the scorched debris, till fresh soil, and begin the long process of replanting. And as we worked under the sun, laughter and conversation filled the air, the fire ironically binding us together more tightly than any HOA meeting ever had. The firefighters even returned off duty one weekend, hauling water in their own trucks to help irrigate the new plantings, a gesture that made me choke up because it proved something Karen had never understood. That real community isn't built on rules and punishments, it's built on people showing up for each other when it matters. Karen, meanwhile, spiraled. Her court appearances were covered in the local paper, each headline more humiliating than the last, and though she tried to cast herself as a victim of a neighborhood conspiracy, the evidence stacked against her was undeniable, and when her own insurance company refused to cover her legal costs on the grounds of willful misconduct, the financial strain became obvious. Her yard grew unkempt. Her once pristine SUV vanished from the driveway, likely repossessed, and whispers circulated that she had taken out a second mortgage just to stay afloat, all while her former HOA allies avoided her calls, unwilling to be dragged down with her. By the time the verdict came, guilty on 2 counts, with fines hefty enough to cover not only my damages but also the fire department's response costs, Karen was a shell of the tyrant she once was, her shrill voice reduced to bitter muttering whenever anyone passed her house, and the final poetic twist came one evening when I spotted a bright red for sale sign staked in her front lawn, its glossy plastic reflecting the sunset like a beacon of her downfall. She had lost her position, her reputation, and now even the home she once lorded over us all with. And though part of me almost pitied her, the larger part simply felt relief, because justice, though slow, had finally caught up. Standing in my newly sprouted fields months later, green shoots pushing stubbornly through blackened earth, I realized Karen's fire had done something she never intended. It had burned away not just my crops, but her reign, her fear, her false authority, leaving behind a neighborhood free to breathe. And for the first time in years, I looked at my land not with dread of her next scheme, but with peace, because the Queen of Ashes had finally been reduced to exactly that, ashes scattered in the wind of her own making.